The emerald necklace lay in my jewelry box like a relic of happier times. Robert had given it to me for our 25th anniversary, the same year Sarah graduated summa cum laude from law school. I'd worn it to her graduation, to her bar exam celebration, and to the dinner where she'd announced her engagement to Marcus Wellington III. Each time, she told me how beautiful it looked, how proud she was to have me as her mother. Now, as I fastened the clasp around my 59-year-old neck, I wondered if this would be the last time I'd wear it for my daughter. 5 weeks had passed since our devastating argument about her wedding budget. $85,000. That's what Sarah and Marcus had demanded I contribute to their dream wedding. Not requested, demanded. As if my late husband's pension, the money I'd carefully saved for my retirement, was somehow their inheritance to spend while I was still alive. "Mom, you're being selfish," she'd said, her voice sharp with entitlement. "You're hoarding all that money while Marcus and I are trying to build our future together. Don't you want us to be happy?" I'd tried to explain that happiness didn't require a 7-course plated dinner for 300 guests or a honeymoon suite in the Maldives that cost more than most people's annual salary. I'd offered $20,000, a generous contribution that would cover a beautiful ceremony and reception. But Sarah had looked at me with such disdain, such calculated coldness, that I barely recognized the little girl who used to help me bake cookies for her school fundraisers. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was watering the tomato plants in my modest backyard garden. Sarah's voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we both said things we didn't mean. Could we meet for dinner? I want to work this out." My heart had lifted despite myself. Perhaps the silence between us had given her time to reflect. Perhaps planning a wedding had helped her understand the value of money, the importance of living within one's means. "I'd like that, sweetheart," I'd said, already planning what I'd say to rebuild the bridge between us. "Actually, Marcus and I thought we'd take you somewhere special. You know, that steakhouse on 5th Street, Morton's. The one where you and Dad used to celebrate your anniversaries. Morton's, where Robert had proposed 31 years ago. Where we toasted every major milestone in our marriage. Where the lighting was dim enough to hide the tears I suspected we'd both shed as we found our way back to each other." Now, as I applied my lipstick with the steady hand of a woman who'd learned to project strength even when she felt uncertain, I allowed myself a moment of cautious hope. Maybe Sarah's engagement had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that family meant more than extravagant celebrations and social media-worthy moments. The drive to Morton's took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised Sarah and her younger brother David, past the private school where I'd volunteered as a reading tutor, past the tennis club where I'd driven her to lessons every Saturday for 6 years, past the community theater where she'd starred in the senior production of Our Town. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I hoped we could continue writing together. Morton's looked exactly as I remembered. Stone facade, valet parking, the soft glow of chandeliers visible through heavy curtains. I checked my watch, 7 o'clock exactly. Sarah had always appreciated punctuality, a trait she'd inherited from her father. The maitre d', a distinguished man with silver hair, led me to a private dining room where Sarah was already seated. My daughter looked stunning in a way that successful lawyers often do, polished, confident, commanding attention. She wore a designer suit I didn't recognize, something that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. "Mom." She rose to embrace me, and for a moment, breathing in her expensive perfume, I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my life for 31 years. "You look wonderful, sweetheart," I said, and I meant it. Whatever our differences, whatever tension lay between us, she was still my daughter. "Thank you for coming. I know things have been difficult." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Marcus should be here any minute. He got delayed at the firm." Marcus Wellington III, 34 years old, ambitious, charming when it served his purposes. He worked at one of the city's most prestigious law firms and had the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. I tried to like him, tried to see what Sarah saw beyond his expensive suits and casual assumptions about other people's obligations. "I'm glad you called," I said, settling into my chair. I've missed you. Something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Regret? But before I could examine it further, Marcus appeared at our table, not alone, but accompanied by two men in dark suits carrying briefcases. Mrs. Coleman, Marcus said, his smile too bright, too practiced. Thank you for joining us tonight. The men took seats around our intimate table, transforming our family dinner into what felt like a business meeting. My stomach tightened as I recognized the orchestrated nature of their arrival. This wasn't coincidence. This was planned. Sarah, I said carefully, who are these gentlemen? Mom, these are some colleagues of Marcus's. Her voice was steady, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at. One of the men, distinguished-looking with the kind of predatory confidence I'd learned to recognize in my years working as a paralegal, leaned forward. Mrs. Coleman, I'm Jonathan Pierce, Marcus's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will benefit everyone involved. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd experienced 5 weeks ago when Sarah had first made her demands. But this time, instead of anger, I felt something colder. Something that had been building in the weeks of silence. What kind of documents? I asked, though I already knew this conversation would not end well. Marcus cleared his throat. It's really quite straightforward, Mrs. Coleman. We're asking you to establish a joint account with Sarah and me. Given that you're living alone now and considering the complexity of managing investments and retirement funds, it just makes sense to have younger people helping with your financial decisions. My age, I repeated quietly. I'm 59, Marcus. Not 99. Of course, he said, his tone patronizing. But you have to admit, financial planning is complex. Estate management, tax implications. It's not something you should have to handle alone. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to show some sign that this ambush wasn't her idea. But she sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, studying her manicured nails. The attorney pushed a manila folder across the table. If you could just sign here and here, we can get everything arranged tonight. I opened the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. Documents that would give Marcus and Sarah access to my accounts, my retirement funds, my insurance policies, everything Robert and I had worked 35 years to build. And if I don't sign? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Sarah finally looked up, and the expression in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, final. Then you'll make things very difficult for everyone, she said simply. Marcus and I have been discussing this with his family. The Wellingtons are very influential in this city. They have connections, social, professional, legal. It would be unfortunate if your reputation in the community became complicated. The restaurant seemed to fade around me. The soft piano music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other diners, it all became white noise. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, supported through law school, and tried to understand when exactly she'd become a stranger. I see, I said quietly. I reached into my purse, past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo of Sarah and David that I'd carried for years. My fingers found my phone, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Mom. Sarah's voice had a note of uncertainty now. What are you doing? I pressed the call button and waited for the familiar voice to answer. Hello, David. It's Mom. I need you to come to Morton Steakhouse on 5th Street. The private dining room. Yes, I know it's late. Yes, I know you have surgery in the morning. Just come. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table beside the manila folder. I think, I said, looking directly at Sarah, that before I sign anything, someone else should hear what's being proposed. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Marcus shifted in his seat, his confident facade cracking slightly around the edges. The two attorneys exchanged glances, the kind of look seasoned predators share when their prey doesn't behave as expected. Mom, Sarah said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager, there's no need to involve David in this. This is between us. Is it? I folded my hands in my lap, surprised by how steady they felt. Because it seems to me that when you bring lawyers to what you called a reconciliation dinner, you've already involved quite a few people. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. Mrs. Coleman, perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional. Can they? I met his gaze directly. How thoughtful of you to notice. 26 minutes. That's how long it would take David to drive from the hospital if he didn't hit traffic. 26 minutes, during which I had to navigate this minefield without stepping on the explosives my daughter had so carefully arranged. Marcus leaned forward, his lawyer's smile firmly in place. Look, Mrs. Coleman, Margaret, may I call you Margaret? We're going to be family soon. You may call me Mrs. Coleman. His smile faltered for just a moment. Of course. Mrs. Coleman, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you optimize your financial position. You know, maximize your returns, ensure proper estate planning. I see. And what would this optimization cost me? I'm sorry. Your help with my finances. What's your fee? The lawyers stirred uncomfortably. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There would be some administrative costs naturally, but really, this is about family. About making sure Sarah and I can provide for our children when that time comes. Children? I turned to my daughter, who was studying her wine glass with sudden intensity. Tell me, Sarah, when exactly did you start planning this evening? Mom, I don't know what you mean. When did you call Marcus's lawyer friends? Before or after you called me about reconciliation? She lifted her chin, and there was Robert's stubborn streak, twisted into something I didn't recognize. Does it matter? It matters to me. Fine. The word came out sharp, brittle. We've been discussing options for weeks. Ever since you made it clear that you don't care about my happiness or my future. Options, I tasted the word, found it bitter. Is that what we're calling financial coercion now? It's not coercion. Sarah's voice rose, drawing glances from the adjoining room. It's family. It's what families do for each other. What families do, I said quietly, is support each other without lawyers and ultimatums. The younger attorney, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, leaned forward. Mrs. Coleman, perhaps you should know that in cases where elderly parents are resistant to family financial planning, there are legal remedies available. Excuse me. The voice came from behind me, familiar and warm. David stood beside our table, still wearing his surgical scrubs, his dark hair mussed from what had obviously been a rushed drive. At 34, my son had inherited his father's steady presence and his grandmother's sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm Dr. Coleman, he said to the table in general, though his gaze lingered on Marcus. I believe my mother called me. David, I gestured to an empty chair the waiter had quickly provided. I'd like you to meet your sister's colleagues. David's eyes swept the table, taking in the lawyers, the manila folder, the tension thick enough to cut. As a neurosurgeon, he'd learned to assess situations quickly, and I watched him catalog every detail with the precision that had made him one of the youngest department heads at Presbyterian Hospital. Colleagues, he repeated slowly. I see. And what brings colleagues to a family dinner? Marcus stood, extending his hand. Marcus Wellington, your sister's fiancé. These are some business associates of mine. We were just discussing some financial planning with your mother. David shook Marcus's hand briefly, then sat down without acknowledging the lawyers. Financial planning at Morton's on a Thursday night with Sarah 6 months pregnant. He looked at his sister. How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications? I'm fine, Sarah said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. Good. That's good. David picked up the manila folder, flipped through it with the casual expertise of someone who'd seen plenty of legal documents. Joint account management. Interesting. Mom, did you ask for help with your finances? I did not. He closed the folder, set it aside. Marcus, Sarah, gentlemen, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother? Now wait just a minute, Marcus started, but David's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. I'm not asking. Something in my son's tone, the same authority he used when dealing with difficult patients or uncooperative family members in the ICU, made the lawyers shift uncomfortably. Marcus looked to Sarah for support, but she was staring at her hands again. "We'll be right over there," Jonathan Pierce said, gesturing toward the bar area. "Mrs. Coleman, please don't make any hasty decisions." After they'd moved away, David leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mom, talk to me. What's really going on here?" For the first time that evening, I felt tears threaten. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of recognition, of knowing that at least one of my children still saw me as a person rather than a resource to be managed. "They want me to give them control of my accounts," I said. "Sarah says if I don't, there will be consequences for my reputation in the community." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I remembered from his childhood. Something he did when he was thinking hard, working through a complex problem. How much did they originally ask for the wedding? $85,000. He whistled low. "And you offered?" $20,000, which was generous. More than generous. He glanced toward the bar where Marcus was gesticulating to the lawyers, probably explaining why this family meeting wasn't going according to plan. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Are you having any problems? Memory issues, confusion with finances, anything that might make them think you need help managing your affairs?" I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. "David, last month I caught an error in my investment statement that saved me $3,000. I renegotiated my insurance policies to save another $800 annually. And I've been helping Mrs. Patterson next door with her taxes for the past 5 years. Does that sound like someone who needs financial management?" "No, it doesn't." His jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of Robert when he was truly angry. Not the quick flash of irritation, but the deep, cold fury that came from witnessing genuine injustice. It sounds like someone who taught her son how to be financially responsible so well that he graduated medical school with minimal debt. "You worked for that." "I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. You showed me how to prioritize, how to sacrifice for what matters." He looked toward Sarah, who was watching us from across the restaurant with an expression I couldn't read. "What happened to her, Mom? When did she become this person?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, maybe years. When had my daughter's ambition curdled into entitlement? When had her dreams become demands? When had her love become conditional on what I could provide rather than who I was? "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy. Or maybe Marcus happened to her." I followed his gaze to where my daughter's fiancé was now on his phone, his voice animated, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. Even from across the room, I could see the calculation in his posture, the way he positioned himself to command attention. "You think he's behind this?" "I think he's a man who sees an opportunity," David said. "But I also think Sarah is 31 years old and responsible for her own choices. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Before I could answer, Marcus was striding back toward our table, the lawyers trailing behind him like a well-dressed pack. Sarah followed more slowly, one hand pressed protectively to her stomach. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, not sounding sorry at all, "but we do have a timeline we're working with. The wedding is in 4 months, and there are significant expenses that need to be addressed." "Of course," I said, standing up slowly. "Timeline. How thoughtful of you to mention that." I picked up my purse, checking to make sure my phone was easily accessible. Around us, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of couples sharing wine, families celebrating achievements, friends catching up over steak, normal people living normal lives, unaware that at table 7, a family was being dissected with surgical precision. "I've made my decision," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah's face went very still. Marcus leaned forward slightly, and I smiled. The same smile I'd worn to parent-teacher conferences when dealing with teachers who underestimated my children. The same smile I'd perfected during 35 years of marriage to a man who occasionally tested my patience, but never my loyalty. "I'll consider your proposal," I said. "But first, there's someone else I'd like you to meet." I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I'd added just 3 weeks ago, a precaution I'd taken after Sarah's first ultimatum when a mother's intuition had whispered that this reconciliation dinner might be anything but reconciling. "Patricia?" I said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Margaret Coleman." "Yes, I know it's late. Could you come to Morton Steakhouse on 5th Street? The private dining room. Bring the documents we discussed." Marcus's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something approaching alarm. "Who is Patricia?" I set the phone down carefully, noting how the simple act of making a call could change the entire energy of a room. The lawyers were whispering among themselves now, and Sarah was looking between Marcus and me with growing unease. "Patricia Hansen," I said pleasantly. "My attorney." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more dangerous. Jonathan Pierce's predatory smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter who'd suddenly realized he might be the one being hunted. "Your attorney," Marcus repeated slowly. "When did you hire an attorney?" "The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state," I replied, watching his face carefully. "Did you really think Mrs. Henderson would mention that a nice young man had stopped by asking whether I'd been acting strangely lately? Whether I'd been forgetting things, making poor decisions?" Sarah's face went pale. "Mom, we never." "Never what, sweetheart?" "Never had Marcus drive through my neighborhood photographing my house? Never had him chat with my mail carrier about whether I'd been receiving unusual mail? Never had his friend from the bank make inquiries about my account activity?" I kept my voice conversational, almost maternal. "Never had him research the market value of my home to see what it might sell for?" David leaned back in his chair, and I could see him putting the pieces together with the rapid assessment skills that made him exceptional at his job.
Jesus, Sarah.
"How long have you been planning this?" "It's not what you think," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I opened my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope. "Because I think it's exactly what it looks like. A systematic attempt to establish grounds for claiming I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs." I spread the contents of the envelope across the table. Photographs Marcus had taken of my house. Printed emails between him and a private investigator. Copies of inquiries he'd made about my medical records, my banking habits, my daily routines. "Patricia has been very thorough," I explained as the lawyers examined the documents, with growing discomfort. "It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator, especially when that investigator looks like someone's grandmother." The youngest lawyer was actually sweating now. "Mrs. Coleman, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions." "Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly," I said, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. "The question is whether you gentlemen understood what you were being asked to participate in." Patricia arrived exactly 14 minutes later, striding through Morton's with the purposeful energy of a woman who'd spent 35 years practicing family law and had seen every variation of human greed and manipulation. At 68, she was small and silver-haired with a kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel underestimate her at their own peril. "Margaret," she said warmly, settling into the chair David had procured. "And this must be your daughter. Congratulations on your pregnancy, dear." The contrast was immediate and devastating. Where I had been isolated at this table, surrounded by predators, Patricia's presence shifted the balance entirely. Suddenly, Marcus and his lawyers were outnumbered by people who actually understood the law. "Gentlemen," Patricia said, surveying the group with a clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a particularly interesting tumor, "I believe you have some documents you'd like Mrs. Coleman to consider." She opened her own briefcase, removing a thick folder. "But before we discuss any joint account arrangements, I think you should see what Mrs. Coleman has already put in place." The papers she spread across the table were pristine, official, bearing the seal of the county courthouse. As Marcus leaned forward to read them, I watched his face change from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic. "Irrevocable trust," Patricia explained conversationally. "Established 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Coleman's assets, her house, her investment accounts, her retirement funds, have all been transferred to the Margaret Coleman Family Trust." "That's..." Marcus started, then stopped, his legal knowledge apparently insufficient for the situation he found himself in. That's what, dear? Patricia asked sweetly. The trust, Sarah said slowly, reading over Marcus's shoulder. It says the beneficiaries are your grandchildren. I finished. Both born and unborn, with David as the trustee until they reach the age of 25. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. I could see him calculating, recalculating, trying to find an angle that would still give him access to the money he'd been counting on. But what about the wedding, he demanded. What about our plans? What about them? Patricia asked. The trust provides for educational expenses, medical care, and reasonable living costs for the beneficiaries. I don't see how a $40,000 wedding dress qualifies as any of those things. This is ridiculous, Marcus said, his composure finally cracking. Sarah, tell them. Tell them we had an understanding. Did you? David asked his sister quietly. Did you have an understanding, or did you have demands backed by threats? Sarah looked around the table, at Marcus's angry face, at the lawyers who were already calculating how to distance themselves from this mess, at David's disappointed expression, at Patricia's professional calm. Finally, her gaze settled on me. I'm pregnant, she said, as if that explained everything. We need security. We need to know our child will be provided for. Your child will be provided for, I said gently. Better than you can imagine. The trust will pay for the finest education, the best medical care, every opportunity a grandmother could want to give. But Marcus won't have access to a penny of it. You can't do this, Marcus said, his voice rising. Sarah is your daughter. You can't cut her out of your inheritance over a wedding. I'm not cutting her out of anything, I replied. I'm protecting her inheritance from you. Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that had probably terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades. Mr. Wellington, perhaps you'd like to call your own attorney? Because I think you might need some independent legal advice about the implications of what we've discovered about your premarital investigation of your fiancé's mother. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus looked to Jonathan Pierce for support, but the older lawyer was already gathering his papers. I think, Pierce said carefully, that we may have been operating under some misunderstandings about the nature of this situation. Perhaps it would be best if we postponed any document signing until everyone has had time to consult with their respective counsel. Excellent idea, Patricia agreed. Mrs. Coleman, shall we go? I think you've accomplished what you came here to do. I stood slowly, taking my time, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over the table like dust after an explosion. Sarah was crying now, silent tears that might have been genuine grief or calculated manipulation.
I found I no longer cared which.
Sarah, I said softly, and she looked up with something that might have been hope. When you're ready to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, call me. But call me alone. I turned to Marcus, who was staring at the trust documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. As for you, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 59 years learning how to recognize predators, stay away from my family, stay away from my home. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my competency or my finances, Patricia and I will have a very different kind of conversation about harassment and elder abuse. David stood as well, pulling money from his wallet to cover whatever drinks had been ordered. Sarah, he said to his sister, you're welcome at my place if you need somewhere to think, but you come alone and you leave the financial scheming at the door. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear Marcus's voice rising behind us, arguing with the lawyers, with Sarah, with anyone who would listen about fairness and rights and the unfairness of it all. The sound followed us out into the cool evening air, where it was absorbed by the vast indifference of the universe. How do you feel? Patricia asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside Morton's. I considered the question carefully. Inside the restaurant, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who had seen her primarily as a pathway to easy money. Inside, Marcus was learning that there were still women in the world who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated into surrendering what they'd built. Free, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel free. Patricia nodded approvingly.
Good.
Now comes the hard part, deciding what you want to build with that freedom. For weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for two, watching the morning sun paint geometric patterns across the hardwood floor Robert and I had refinished 20 years ago. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. There was a distinction I was only beginning to understand. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:30. I'd come to appreciate punctuality even more since Morton's, since I'd learned the value of people who said what they meant and did what they promised. Right on time, I said, opening the door to find Elizabeth Chin holding a plate of homemade scones and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had news to share. I brought lemon scones, Elizabeth said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers over the past weeks. And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday. Elizabeth had appeared in my life like a small miracle disguised as a coincidence. 3 days after the dinner at Morton's, she'd knocked on my door, introducing herself as my new neighbor, a recent widow who'd moved to the house across the street after 47 years in the suburbs where she'd raised 3 children. At 71, Elizabeth was trim and energetic with silver hair she wore in an elegant chignon and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough of life to know what mattered and what didn't. More importantly, she had a gift for listening without judgment and a complete immunity to other people's drama. What kind of interesting? I asked, pouring coffee into the mugs we'd picked out together at the antique shop downtown, part of what Elizabeth called my reclaiming project. Marcus Wellington was at the bank yesterday, she said, accepting her mug with the satisfied expression of someone who enjoyed a good story. Apparently, he was quite upset about some credit applications being denied. I sat down across from her, noting how natural this felt, having someone to share coffee with, someone who understood that gossip could be a form of justice when it exposed the right truths to the right people. Denied credit? Seems his law firm discovered some irregularities in his expense reports. Something about client entertainment being charged to personal accounts. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with a particular pleasure that came from watching Karma work with efficient precision. Word is he might be facing some professional review. I absorbed this information with the careful neutrality I'd perfected over the past month. Since Morton's, I'd learned that revenge was most satisfying when it was served by someone other than yourself, when the universe simply adjusted itself to reflect the natural consequences of poor choices. And Sarah? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Shopping for maternity clothes at the outlet mall. Apparently, the Italian honeymoon has been postponed indefinitely. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking our coffee and listening to the sounds of our neighborhood coming alive. Children walking to school, cars starting, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life continuing despite the small dramas that occasionally disrupted it. Have you heard from David? Elizabeth asked. Yesterday. He said Sarah called him asking if he thought she was making a mistake. I set down my mug carefully. He told her that was a question only she could answer. Smart boy.
Smart man, he corrected.
He gets that from his father. The phone rang, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my body's automatic response to unexpected calls. But when I checked the display, it showed a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but not one of my contacts. Mrs. Coleman? The voice was young, female, nervous. This is Rachel Morrison from the Community Legal Aid Society. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all. How can I help you? Well, this might sound strange, but we heard about your situation from Patricia Hansen. She mentioned that you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities. I looked at Elizabeth, who was listening with the polite attention of someone who'd learned that other people's phone calls often contained interesting information. What kind of opportunities? We have a program for seniors who are dealing with family financial exploitation. People whose children or relatives are trying to take advantage of them. Patricia thought you might be uniquely qualified to help. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family crisis might become the foundation for helping others navigate similar treacheries. But there was something appealing about the idea, something that felt like turning poison into medicine. Tell me more, I said. For the next 20 minutes, Rachel explained the program. Seniors helping seniors, sharing strategies for recognizing manipulation, resources for legal protection, emotional support for those who'd been betrayed by the people they'd trusted most. It was part support group, part advocacy organization, part early warning system for a community that was increasingly targeted by sophisticated scammers, both professional and familial. We meet Wednesday evenings at 7, Rachel concluded. Very informal, coffee and conversation mostly, but we've helped quite a few people avoid situations like what Patricia described. I'll think about it, I said, though I was already thinking about it, already imagining myself in a room full of people who understood the particular pain of being seen as a resource rather than a person. After I hung up, Elizabeth was looking at me with the expression of someone who'd recognized something significant.
You're going to do it, she said.
It wasn't a question. Probably. I paused. Good. You need something that's yours, something that has nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother or potential victim. It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had made Elizabeth such an unexpected gift in my life. She understood transformation not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a gradual reclaiming of space that had always belonged to you. The afternoon brought another call, this one from David. Mom, I wanted to give you a heads up. Sarah's been asking questions about the trust, specifically about whether there are any ways to modify it. I felt a familiar stirring of irritation, but it was different now, cleaner, more focused. Not the helpless rage of someone being attacked, but the purposeful annoyance of someone whose boundaries were being tested. Let me guess, I said. Marcus's idea? Probably. But Mom, she's the one making the calls. She's the one who chose to pursue this.
He paused.
There's something else. She asked if I thought you'd change your mind if she ended the engagement. What did you tell her? I told her that decisions motivated by money rarely lead to happiness, but that her relationship with Marcus wasn't really my business. He paused. I also told her that if she wanted to repair things with you, it would have to start with an honest conversation about what she'd done and why she'd done it. And she hung up on me. I absorbed this information with the same calm acceptance I'd brought to every revelation of the past month. Each piece of evidence that Sarah had chosen Marcus, chosen money, chosen manipulation over family, simply confirmed what I already knew. That my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize. And that protecting myself from her choices was not cruelty, but necessity. David, I said, I want you to know that whatever happens with Sarah, it doesn't change anything between us. You're a good man and a good son, and I'm proud of the life you've built. Mom, his voice was thick with emotion. I keep thinking I should be able to fix this somehow. Mediate between you two. Find some middle ground. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart. Some things can only be accepted. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, looking at it with new eyes. The living room where Sarah had studied for the bar exam. The kitchen where I'd taught her to make Robert's favorite pot roast. The hallway lined with family photos that suddenly seemed like documentation of a story that had ended. But endings, I was learning, were also beginnings. Tomorrow, I would call Rachel Morrison and volunteer for the Community Legal Aid Program. Next week, Elizabeth and I were driving to the art museum she'd wanted to visit since her husband died. Next month, Patricia and I were meeting to discuss starting a financial literacy workshop for women my age who'd never managed money independently. The future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted road. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious about where it might lead. There would be other dinners, other conversations, other opportunities to choose dignity over desperation, wisdom over wishful thinking. The emerald necklace still hung in my jewelry box, but I was already imagining other occasions, other versions of myself I had yet to discover. The woman who'd walked into Morton's 4 weeks ago had been someone's potential victim. The woman who'd walked out was something much more dangerous to people like Marcus Wellington. She was someone who could not be moved. 7 months after Morton's, I stood in the community center's main hall, watching 15 women and 4 men arrange folding chairs in a circle. At 74, Dorothy Williams moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent her retirement years discovering that age was just another challenge to overcome. James Patterson, barely 62, but carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting his daughter's drug addiction for years, carefully placed tissues on the small table in the center of our circle, a practical gesture that acknowledged the tears that often accompanied our Wednesday evening meetings. "New face tonight," Elizabeth murmured, settling into the chair beside mine. She'd started attending the meetings 2 weeks after I did, claiming she wanted to learn how to spot the warning signs of financial exploitation. What she'd really wanted was to support me, but Elizabeth had a gift for making practical altruism seem like mere curiosity. I followed her gaze to where a new woman sat uncertainly near the door, clutching a purse like a shield. She was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who'd once had money and was now learning to dress on a budget. Her hair was perfectly styled, but I could see the telltale signs of stress in the way she held her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. "First time?" I said, recognizing the particular brand of shell-shocked dignity that accompanied people to their first meeting. "I'll talk to her after." The past 7 months had taught me that there were as many ways to be financially exploited as there were families willing to rationalize theft as love. I'd heard stories that made Sarah's demands seem almost quaint by comparison. Sons who'd forged their mother's signatures on reverse mortgages. Daughters who'd used their father's credit cards to fund shopping addictions. Grandchildren who'd systematically emptied their grandparents' accounts while promising to invest the money. But I'd also witnessed recoveries that proved the human capacity for rebuilding was far stronger than the capacity for destruction. Patricia had become something of a legend in our group, having helped 23 people establish protective trusts, prosecute 4 cases of elder abuse, and recover nearly $300,000 in stolen assets. "Good evening, everyone," I said, calling the meeting to order with the natural authority I discovered in myself over the past months. "For our newcomers, I'm Margaret Coleman, and this is our weekly gathering for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members." The words still carried a sting, but it was the clean pain of a healing wound rather than the infected agony of a fresh betrayal. I'd learned to own my story, to tell it without shame, to use it as a tool for helping others recognize their own worth. "Tonight, we're going to talk about rebuilding," I continued. "After you've protected yourself, after you've set boundaries, after you've stopped the immediate threat, what comes next?" It was a question I could finally answer with authority because I'd lived it. The immediate aftermath of Morton's had been about damage control and legal protection. But the real work had been quieter, more personal, learning to trust my own judgment again, rebuilding relationships that mattered, discovering who I was when I wasn't defending myself against attack. "For me," said Thomas Chen, a 70-year-old retired accountant whose son had been systematically draining his retirement account, "what came next was realizing I could make new friends and enjoy it." Nods around the circle. Independence was a common theme in our group, not the fierce isolation that came from being hurt, but the satisfied solitude that came from choosing your own company over toxic relationships. "I learned I didn't have to forgive anyone," added Maria Santos, whose daughter had stolen her identity to open credit cards. That was huge for me. Everyone kept saying I had to forgive her because she was family. But Dr. Coleman helped me understand that forgiveness isn't mandatory for healing. David had become an unofficial counselor to our group, stopping by once a month to discuss the psychological aspects of family financial abuse. His insights had helped me understand that my guilt over Sarah wasn't maternal failure. It was a normal response to an abnormal situation. "What about you, Margaret?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the newest regular in our group. "What came after for you?" I considered the question, looking around the circle at faces that had become familiar, dear even. These people had seen me cry, rage, doubt myself, and gradually find my footing again. They'd earned an honest answer. "Purpose," I said finally. "For 35 years, my purpose was being a wife and mother. After Robert died, I thought my purpose was protecting what we'd built so I could pass it on to my children. But what came after was discovering that my real purpose might be protecting other people's mothers from what I went through." It was true. The volunteer work had evolved into something larger, a consulting practice where I helped other women navigate family financial crises. Patricia had referred several clients to me, and I discovered I had a talent for spotting manipulation tactics and helping people develop strategies for resistance. "How do you handle the sadness?" asked the new woman, speaking for the first time. Her voice was soft, cultured, carrying the particular sadness of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. How do you stop missing who they used to be? The question hit the center of something I'd been avoiding. Because the truth was, I did miss Sarah. Not the manipulative woman she'd become, but the little girl who'd helped me plant tulips in the spring. The teenager who'd called me from college just to hear my voice. The young woman who'd been genuinely excited about starting her legal career. I don't think you stop missing them, I admitted. I think you learn to mourn them while protecting yourself from them. It's possible to grieve someone who's still alive. The meeting continued for another hour, covering practical matters, new legal resources, upcoming workshops, success stories from former members who'd reclaimed their lives. But that question about missing them lingered, following me home to the house where Elizabeth was waiting with leftover soup and the latest update on her own complicated family dynamics. "How was group?" she asked, settling into what had become her chair at my kitchen table.
Good. Hard.
A new woman asked about missing the people our families used to be. Elizabeth nodded slowly. At 71, she'd survived her own son's attempts to pressure her into selling her house and moving into assisted living, not because she needed care, but because he wanted access to her equity. Her solution had been to move across the street from me and inform him that his inheritance was now being spent on her happiness. "Speaking of missing people," she said carefully, David called. Sarah had her baby. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them for weeks. A grandson, David had told me earlier. Due in mid-November, according to his calculations from Sarah's earlier pregnancy announcements. "How is she?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I meant Sarah or the baby. "Everyone's healthy. 8 pounds, 4 ounces. They named him Robert." Robert. My husband's name. The manipulation was so transparent, so calculated, that I felt momentarily dizzy with the audacity of it. "David said Sarah asked him to call you," Elizabeth continued. "She wanted you to know that visiting hours are flexible and that she'd very much like to see you." I sat quietly, feeling the pull of grandmotherly instinct warring with the hard-won wisdom of the past 7 months. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital, to hold this new person who shared my DNA, to forgive everything for the chance to be part of his life. But I'd learned to distrust my immediate emotional responses, to examine them for signs of manipulation, both external and internal. "What do you think she wants?" I asked. "I think she wants to use that baby to reopen negotiations about the trust." It was probably true. In the months since Morton's, Sarah had made several indirect approaches. Messages through David, cards on my birthday, carefully orchestrated encounters at places she knew I frequented. Each contact had carried the subtle suggestion that reconciliation was possible if I was willing to be reasonable about certain financial arrangements. "The baby isn't responsible for his parents' choices," I said, more to myself than to Elizabeth. "No, he's not. But you're not responsible for protecting yourself from his parents' choices, either." The next morning, I called Patricia. "I've been expecting this call," she said without preamble. "Sarah had the baby."
She did.
"And now I have to decide what comes next. What do you want to come next?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since Elizabeth had delivered the news. What did I want? Not what Sarah wanted, not what David thought was best, not what society expected of grandmothers. What did I actually want? "I want to meet my grandson," I said slowly. "But I want to do it on my terms, with clear boundaries, and without opening myself up to manipulation." "That's possible," Patricia said. "We can arrange supervised visits through David. We can establish clear protocols about what topics are off-limits, what behaviors will end visits, what consequences will follow if those boundaries are violated. And if Sarah refuses those terms, then you'll know exactly where you stand with her. And more importantly, you'll know you protected yourself while leaving the door open for a genuine relationship if she ever chooses to walk through it." That afternoon, I drafted a letter to my daughter. Not the angry tirade I'd written and rewritten in my head over the past months, but a clear, calm statement of boundaries and possibilities. "Sarah," it began, "I would very much like to meet Robert and to have a relationship with him as he grows. However, any contact between us must respect the boundaries I've established for my own well-being. I am willing to visit with Robert in David's presence for limited periods, with the understanding that any attempt to discuss the trust, my financial decisions, or past grievances will end the visit immediately. If you can accept these terms, please have David arrange our first meeting. If you cannot, I hope you'll reconsider when you're ready to prioritize Robert's relationship with his grandmother over your relationship with my money. I will always love the daughter you were. I am no longer available to be victimized by the person you've chosen to become. With hope for your growth and boundaries for my protection, Mom. I sealed the letter before I could second-guess myself, then walked to the mailbox with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between giving up and setting terms. The future was still unwritten, but I would write it on my own terms, with my own pen, in my own voice. And if my grandson wanted to be part of that story, he would be welcomed with love, wisdom, and the fierce protection of a grandmother who'd learned that the greatest gift you can give a child is the example of a woman who cannot be moved. 2 weeks later, I stood in David's living room, watching my daughter adjust a baby blanket with the careful attention of a new mother. Sarah looked older somehow, not just tired from childbirth, but marked by the kind of stress that came from watching carefully laid plans crumble. Marcus was noticeably absent. "He's perfect," I said, looking down at the baby in my arms. Robert, little Bobby, had Sarah's dark hair and what I hoped were traces of his grandfather's steady temperament. "He is," Sarah agreed, and for a moment, we were just two women admiring a beautiful child. "David said you wanted to talk," I said, settling into the rocking chair that had once been mine, that David had moved to his house when I downsized. "I did." Sarah sat on the couch across from me, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture that reminded me of the nervous teenager she'd once been. "I wanted to apologize." The words hung in the air between us. I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or calculated manipulation. After 7 months of helping other people navigate similar situations, I'd learned to recognize the difference. "For what, specifically?" I asked. "For Morton's. For the lawyers. For..." She gestured helplessly. "For all of it." "And Marcus." Something flickered across her face. Pain, regret, embarrassment. "Marcus and I are separated. We have been for 3 weeks." I absorbed this information without surprise. Patricia had mentioned rumors about Marcus's professional difficulties, about mounting pressure from his law firm, about the kind of financial stress that revealed character flaws that had always been there. "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. Not sorry that Marcus was gone, but sorry that Sarah was learning these lessons in such a painful way. "Are you?" she asked, and there was something raw in her voice, something that sounded like the daughter I remembered. "I'm sorry you're hurt. I'm sorry you're scared. I'm sorry you're facing single motherhood under these circumstances." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not sorry that you're learning the difference between love and manipulation." She was quiet for a long moment, watching me rock her son. "I know you think Marcus was behind everything. Wasn't he? He was behind the planning, the lawyers, the investigation of your finances." She took a shaky breath. "But the entitlement, the assumption that your money was somehow mine to claim, that was all me. That's who I'd become." It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in months, maybe years. And it hurt more than her lies had because it confirmed what I'd been afraid to admit, that somewhere along the way, I'd lost my daughter to a version of herself I didn't recognize. "Why?" I asked. "Because it was easier," she said simply. "Easier to demand than to earn. Easier to manipulate than to accept what was freely given. Easier to see you as an obstacle than as a person." Bobby stirred in my arms, making the soft sounds that newborns make when they're dreaming. I looked down at him, this innocent child who would grow up shaped by the choices his parents made now. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" "I want another chance," she said. "Not with the money, I understand that's gone. But with you. With us. I want Bobby to know his grandmother. I want to remember how to be your daughter instead of your adversary." I studied her face, looking for signs of the calculation that had marked our interactions for so long. But all I saw was exhaustion, regret, and what might have been genuine hope. "The trust stands," I said. Bobby will be provided for, but through proper channels and with appropriate oversight. No exceptions. I understand. No discussions about my finances, my decisions, or my lifestyle choices. If you have concerns about my well-being, you discuss them with David or Patricia, not with lawyers or investigators. I understand. And if you ever threaten to withhold my grandson as leverage for any reason, you'll never see me again. That's not negotiable. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. I looked down at Bobby again, this little person who carried my husband's name and my hopes for the future. He would grow up knowing his grandmother's love, but he would also grow up understanding the importance of boundaries, of earned trust, of relationships built on respect rather than manipulation. Then we can try, I said. One day at a time, with clear expectations and honest communication. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, I said, standing to place Bobby in her arms. Thank me when you've proven that you mean what you say. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the woman I'd been 7 months ago, desperate to maintain family relationships at any cost, willing to be manipulated out of loneliness and hope. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. The emerald necklace still hung in my jewelry box, but I was no longer the same woman who'd worn it to Morton's. I'd learned to value my own worth, to trust my own judgment, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. And if Sarah could learn the same lessons, if she could rebuild herself into someone worthy of her son's respect and her mother's trust, then perhaps we could write a different ending to our story. But if not, I would be fine. I had Elizabeth's friendship, Patricia's wisdom, David's unwavering support, and a community of people who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be someone's victim. The future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted road, and I was no longer afraid of where it might lead. I had learned, finally and completely, that I could not be moved, not by guilt, not by manipulation, not by the fear of being alone. I was Margaret Coleman, and I was enough.